When the city fell silent, subscribe for more real crime stories, like, share, and join the discussion below. The city went quiet in an instant. One moment, sirens were wailing in the distance, cars honking in traffic, and people rushing through crowded streets. The next, everything stopped. No engines, no voices, no footsteps, just a heavy, eerie silence that pressed down like a blanket. Smoke curled into the sky from a warehouse on Fifth Avenue, and shattered glass littered the sidewalks. Blood slicked the pavement where people had tried to run, only to be caught in the chaos. Detective Mark Harris ducked behind a crumpled car, his heart pounding. He could see shadows moving fast, masked men with rifles, moving in perfect coordination. They weren't just robbers or gang members. This was something bigger, something planned. Mark's radio crackled, but the message was garbled. All units, do not engage, hostages do. The rest of it was lost to static. A young woman screamed from a doorway across the street. Mark sprinted toward her, weaving around debris. Before he could reach her, a shot rang out, and she fell. Mark froze, staring at her motionless form. The city, which had been alive and buzzing just minutes ago, now seemed like a ghost town. He noticed something strange. Stores had their doors wide open, cash registers untouched. No one was looting. The attackers weren't interested in money. They were hunting, taking control. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. People he had known all his life were running, screaming, but the streets themselves seemed trapped in fear, frozen in place. He took a deep breath and ducked into an alley. From above, he could see the smoke rising from multiple buildings. Fires were small but controlled, almost like signals. Sirens finally started wailing again, but they were faint, too far to make a difference. Civilians were trapped in their apartments, some trying to call 911, but the lines were jammed. Mark clenched his fists. He had seen shootings, robberies, even explosions before, but nothing like this. This was an attack designed to paralyze an entire city, to make its people powerless and terrified. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was dangerous. He checked his watch. 9:17 a.m. By now, hundreds could be hurt, or worse. And yet, no one in authority seemed to understand the scale of what was happening. Mark's radio crackled again. "We have multiple hostages, corner attackers." The rest faded. He peeked out from behind the wall, saw masked figures converging on a central square, and realized something terrifying. This was just the beginning. And then, a deafening explosion ripped through the city center, sending debris and fire into the sky. Mark stumbled backward, dust and smoke filling the alley. The city that had moments ago been alive was now silent, trembling under chaos. Mark wiped soot from his face, his ears ringing, heart racing. He knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, but not for long. The attackers were already moving, and the city, paralyzed, had no way to fight back. And that was when Mark realized the entire city had fallen silent. The morning after the explosion, the city streets were deserted. Smoke still hung in the air, curling around streetlights like ghosts. Mark Harris moved cautiously through the debris-strewn avenue, his shoes crunching on broken glass. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant crackle of fires and the occasional siren far off in the distance. It was hard to imagine that just a day ago, this same street had been full of cars, chatter, and the chaos of everyday life. Mark checked his phone. No signal. The city's communication lines were down, jammed, or deliberately cut. That explained why no one had responded in time during the initial attack. Somewhere in the chaos, hundreds of people were trapped or wounded. He knew he had to move fast before the attackers struck again. He ducked into a nearby alley and found a group of frightened civilians huddled together. Among them was a man holding his small daughter close, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "We need to get to safety," Mark said, trying to sound calm. "Do you know where the nearest shelter is?" The man shook his head. "We tried. The streets are blocked. Fires, they're everywhere." Mark nodded grimly. He looked toward the city square where the explosion had originated. The masked attackers were still moving through the streets, organized, methodical. This was no random act of violence. They had planned every step, and the chaos was working in their favor. As he led the civilians down a side street, he saw the aftermath of the attack more clearly. Storefronts shattered, cars burned, traffic lights dangling from wires. Every corner had debris or broken glass. Yet strangely, nothing was being looted. The attackers weren't stealing, they were controlling. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from a nearby building. A group of attackers had breached a pharmacy, dragging out terrified employees. Mark froze. His instinct screamed at him. He couldn't let them get away with this. He motioned for the civilians to hide and crept closer. From a distance, he saw a man in a black mask holding a rifle, shouting orders. Another masked figure moved through the aisles, grabbing boxes of what appeared to be medical supplies. Mark realized these were not just opportunists, they were taking resources. The city was being stripped systematically. A sharp scream pierced the air. One of the attackers fired a warning shot at a fleeing civilian. Mark's heart raced. He knew he had only seconds to act. And then, the ground shook violently as another explosion rocked the street. Windows shattered, flames leaped higher, and dust filled the air. Mark stumbled back, coughing, barely keeping his balance. The attackers weren't stopping. They were escalating. The city, already trembling from fear, was about to fall even deeper into chaos. Mark wiped the soot from his eyes, taking a deep breath. He had to find a way to stop them, but with communications down and the attackers everywhere, it felt impossible. From the smoke-filled square, he heard the low, sinister hum of engines approaching. Tanks? Armored vehicles? Or something worse? Before he could react, a deafening blast tore through the street again, sending a wave of fire toward the civilians he had just led. Mark's eyes widened in horror. This was no longer just an attack, it was a siege. The city's silence had grown heavier, darker, more dangerous. And now it had turned deadly. By the time night fell, the city was unrecognizable. Smoke and fire cast everything in shades of blue and orange, shadows twisting over ruined streets. Mark Harris moved cautiously through the rubble, his eyes scanning every alleyway. The distant sirens had stopped, or maybe no one was left to respond. Civilians huddled in basements and abandoned buildings, terrified to make a sound. The silence was deafening. Mark knew the attackers were still out there, organized, precise, and relentless. Their goal was clear: total control. He came across a group of survivors, men, women, and children, gathered in a ruined parking garage. They had been hiding for hours, afraid to move. A young boy clutched a stuffed animal, eyes wide, whispering questions no one could answer. "We have to move," Mark said quietly. "They're taking the streets. We can't stay here." They started toward a subway entrance that might lead to safety, but the tunnels were dark and foreboding. Mark's flashlight cut through the thick dust, illuminating overturned benches and graffiti on the walls. Every sound echoed: footsteps, coughing, even distant explosions. Suddenly, a massive explosion shook the ground, collapsing part of the subway entrance. Debris rained down, sending the group scrambling. Mark shielded the children, pulling them away from falling rubble. The attackers were everywhere, and now it felt like the city itself was collapsing. Through the smoke, Mark saw a figure, a masked attacker pointing a rifle directly at him. Time slowed. He dove behind a concrete pillar, the shot missing by inches. A civilian screamed behind him. Heart pounding, Mark grabbed a fire extinguisher from the ground and charged, hitting the attacker hard. The man fell, but more were coming, surrounding them in the blue-lit chaos. Mark led the group through a side passage, emerging near a hospital. Flames licked the windows, but inside, he could see doctors and nurses frantically moving, trying to help the wounded. Mark guided the civilians inside. The survivors collapsed onto the floor, exhausted, coughing, and crying. Outside, the attackers paused briefly, regrouping in the streets. Their plan had worked. The city had fallen silent, the population trapped, and fear had taken full control. Mark took a deep breath, his face streaked with soot and blood. He looked out a shattered window at the city skyline, flickering with fires and explosions. This was more than a crime. It was an attack on the heart of the city itself. The survivors looked up at him, eyes full of fear and hope. He knew that if they stayed here, they might live through the night, but the battle for the city was far from over. Suddenly, from across the street, a massive plume of smoke rose higher than any other. A deafening roar followed, a tanker truck engulfed in flames, rolling toward the hospital. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He grabbed the nearest survivors and yelled, "Get down!" The city that had gone silent now threatened to explode in a blaze that could consume everything. And Mark realized, with chilling clarity, that this night was far from over. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was the calm before an even greater storm.